Today I'm reviewing the Fujifilm X-T30. Fuji loaned me this X-T30 along with the X-T3, which you may have already seen my review of it, but I will link to it in the description, along with two lenses, the 16 to 55mm f2.8 and the 23mm f2. In the last couple of weeks, both Raymond and I used both cameras and both lenses on each camera, so I will be able to share specifics about my experience with the X-T30 in today's video, but also some comparisons to the X-T3. If you have watched many of my other gear reviews, you will know that I set the same ground rule every time. My reviews are always based on practicality, because lists of specifications and test targets can be helpful, but I want to know what it's actually like to use the gear out in the real world, which is where I like to be with my gear. So Raymond and I took this Fuji kit on all sorts of outings, and I will share photos and video along with my thoughts on the X-T30. If you've already seen my review of the X-T3, you'll notice that the reviews sound very, very similar. And that's because these camera bodies are very, very similar. Both reviews are worth watching if you're looking at one or the other for purchase, because you'll see the specific photos from each camera and hear a little more about what I found important about each body. Now, I know many of you watching are fluent in Fuji, but I also know that others of you are less familiar with the brand. So let me share with you a little bit about Fujifilm. They make cameras for people who have a passion for taking photos. This is something that I've heard time and again from viewers over the years. So while other brands might be racing to have the most impressive spec sheet, the smartest and fastest autofocus, or the highest frames per second, Fuji is staying competitive in those areas, but seems to be more concerned about the user experience with the gear. They want you to love using the cameras and lenses and still get great photos. So keep that philosophy in mind as you watch this video. Jumping into a little bit of tech talk, both the X-T30 and the X-T3, along with all of the other bodies in the X system lineup, are APS-C bodies, and the lenses are designed for that cropped sensor. That means that the bodies and lenses are often a bit more compact than the other full-frame mirrorless bodies and corresponding lenses out there. The X-T30 is quite compact and still balanced well with the lenses that I used. It has a nub of a grip here that helps you hold onto it with one hand, though I did actually hit the Q button accidentally until I got used to the body. Even though the X-T30 is a pretty small camera, you still have the analog camera style knobs on the top of the camera to go along with the aperture ring that you'll find on the majority of the Fuji lenses. This is where you will notice a big difference between the X-T3 and the X-T30. The X-T30 lacks an ISO dial on the top of the camera. I assigned the command dial to set ISO, so I was still able to change it on the fly without going into the menus. That being said, it's also easy to use your Q menu, which has a bunch of the commonly used settings on it. If you are new to Fujifilm cameras, you will notice those tactile and very obvious controls, which allow you to get started with the basics quite quickly. I don't think I've talked to any photographer that didn't enjoy using those controls. They're a treat. They slow you down and make you a bit more mindful of what you're doing. I did point out in my review of the X-T3, and I'll say it again here, you can configure the camera to behave a bit more traditionally. So you can be quicker on the draw so that you can adjust settings using the command dials, and you have other flexibility like the function button. From my talking to viewers and my own experience, Fuji cameras just seem to be very easy to pick up and get started with, but you have the flexibility if you might end up needing it or wanting to modify how the camera behaves and how you use it. Of course, the most important part of any camera is the images, right? And we were not disappointed here in the images coming out of this little guy. Fuji calls it the little giant, and it truly is. Because the X-T30 and the X-T3 have the same 26 megapixel sensor and the same processor even, you won't see any differences in image quality between the two. They are both stellar. Fuji is known for its depiction of skin tones and also for its film simulations. Speaking of the film simulations, they are widely loved. I know that many of you out there talked about preferring to shoot JPEG only with these simulations and getting a stellar image without having to sit at the computer later on. That being said, you can shoot raw files and have the latitude to process later, or even plug your camera into your computer and use Fuji's X-Raw Studio to choose any of the film simulations for any of your raw images. Or of course, you can edit your raw images as you so choose. Now, I mentioned earlier that the X-T30 is an APS-C sensor camera. Crop sensor cameras do have characteristics that make them a bit different from full-frame sensors. For one, the two lenses I used, the 16 to 55 millimeter and the 23 millimeter, operate very similarly to a 24 to 80 millimeter and a 35 millimeter prime would on a full-frame body. Not a negative thing, just a thing. Many of you wanted to know other comparisons between these APS-C cameras and the full-frame mirrorless bodies out there. And while I didn't do any side-by-side comparisons, there were two situations where, if I was picky, I could say that a full-frame body would have made my photo result a little bit easier to achieve. The first was while doing astrophotography, shooting literally in the dark. I had to use a higher ISO sensitivity than on my full frame bodies, so I ended up with more noise in my final image, which was just remedied in post-processing. And the other thing I noticed was the modifications I would need to make from my normal workflow with a full frame camera to achieve a shallow depth of field. Now, neither of those things would prevent me from using this camera on a day-to-day basis, but they are things to note. And I do discuss both in more length in my review of the X-T30. So if you're interested, you can watch that review when you're done here. I mentioned in the beginning of the video that the X-T30 has eye autofocus. It does. It also has autofocus tracking, both in still photos and video. Both are superb in most situations that I found myself in, but it did struggle a bit in action situations and as the subject got further away from me and therefore, filled a smaller portion of the frame. Again, though, I'm comparing these to the top of the line class leading in autofocus bodies out there. Those bodies don't have Fuji's attention to user experience, and they don't have Fuji's awesome in-camera film simulations. And that doesn't mean that either one is inherently better. It just means that they're different, and you as a consumer can choose which direction you'd like to go. But rest assured that you will be able to capture beautiful images either way. Since I mentioned action, I should mention that the X-T30 can actually be pretty quick in the frames per second department. You can shoot up to 30 frames per second with a 1.25x crop, but still 20 frames per second without the crop. The autofocus, the frame rate, the image quality, all of it really, did generally meet all of the challenges that I threw at it. I also did some video with the X-T30. I do both, as my job is Snapchick, so I always test it out when I have a camera in the lab. You can shoot video at up to 4K at 30 frames per second, and this is one difference between the X-T30 and the X-T3. The X-T3 has the additional option of shooting 4K at 60 frames per second, though there is a crop. Now, neither the X-T30 nor the X-T3 has in-body image stabilization. I also had lenses that do not have image stabilization, so handheld video was pretty much impossible, even when I tried my very hardest to hold the camera steady. Of course, as long as I could rest the camera on something or use a tripod, video quality was stellar. And last, a few more comparisons with the X-T3. The X-T30 is not as weather sealed as the X-T3, though all my research says that it still holds its own if you end up in a bit of weather. Both cameras do have a touchscreen. The X-T30's screen flips up and down, and the X-T3's screen flips up and down and to the side. The X-T30 has one card slot, and the X-T3 has two card slots. Also, the X-T30 has a pop-up flash, and the X-T3 does not, although it does come with a little external flash. It is the same battery in the cameras, and they have a similar battery life. And while battery life is dependent on how you are using the camera, I can say that we used both cameras on hours-long excursions and didn't need to recharge, though I did always bring a power bank because you can charge the camera via USB-C. The X-T30 is positioned as one of the top-end Fuji bodies. The X-T30 has a lower price point and manages to have the majority of the functionality. I personally didn't even have a preference amongst them when I was taking them both out at the same time. Well, I have to pack these away and send these guys back to Fuji, but Raymond and I did thoroughly enjoy using them. We do own a Fuji X100F, and these bodies have the same characteristics that we love, the film simulations, the tactile controls, the image quality, but they also have the flexibility of interchangeable Fuji lenses. I certainly haven't covered every specification and characteristic or comparison in this video, but if there is something that you are still interested in learning about, ask in the comments. If I can't answer it, I'll bet there are some Fuji viewers out there that can help us out. And if you want to check current pricing for the X-T30, the X-T3, or either of these lenses that I have here, there are Amazon links below. And I am an affiliate, so when you use those links, you get the same price, but you are helping to support this channel. So thanks to those of you that use those links. And for everyone else, thank you for watching.